Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we'll be finishing up the front axle, fitting it to the chassis, and having a quick look at the rear axle since other than not steering, it's exactly the same assembly as the front. We're going to start on page 12 where they want us to fit some of the links to the axle. For parts we're going to need an M3 nylock nut, two of the black balls that are kind of a ball in the middle of a spacer, an M3x30, two M3x20s, one ball cup that's open on both sides, one ball cup that you can only get the ball in from one side, and the 55mm turnbuckle. First we'll put together the steering linkage. Now they have an assembled view with a total length from the outside of one ball cup to the other. That's going to make it nice and straightforward. All we need to do is screw the turnbuckle into the two ball cups, and yes, it really is a proper turnbuckle. So if you're screwing it with all your might and it's just not going anywhere, it's probably because it's a reverse thread, so try screwing it the other way. When you've got the length roughly right, matching the diagram, it's worth checking it with a vernier and adjusting. I'm hoping that 3Racing have the length right. It says 81.17mm, so it doesn't sound like they're just making it up. For the next bit, we're going to need the axle and the M3x20 screws. You might have noticed that I've only got the one out on the left, and I probably did that on purpose for a reason that I can't remember, so I had to get another one from the screw pot. We need to install both of them through the bottom of the steering arms, screwing them in all the way so they're fully bottomed out. On the left, as the diff cover faces us, we need to drop one of the long ball ends over the screw threads to act as a spacer. On the right we need the turnbuckle, but first we need to pop one of the long ball ends into the cup. As usual, a pair of pliers and some light force does the trick. It's a bit strange that the linkage to the servo goes under the drag link, but we'll go with it for now, but we might end up changing things around later. Next, because the balls are threaded, we'll need a little bit of thread lock on the threads. Quite well up on the threads, so when we install the balls it'll all get picked up and spread around. Nip up the balls. Now they don't need to be incredibly tight, just bottomed out plus a little bit will do the job just fine. Now we need to clip the drag link in. They're not too difficult to fit by hand, but a pair of pliers can make it that bit easier. The drag link gets fitted with the rod closest to the axle, which does seem a bit odd at first, but it easily clears the axle at full lock and it won't get in the way of the terrain, so why not? The last step on page 12 is to install the two 64.7mm links on the top of the axle. They slot in above the diff quite nicely. Line them up the best you can and start feeding the M3x30 through the hole. With a bit of a wiggle it should pass straight through with very little fuss. On the threads that are now sticking out we need to fit the nylock nut. Now it's important not to over tighten it. It's tempting to crank it down, but there's really no need. The nut's job here is only to stop the screw from falling out. Doing it up tight will only crush the plastic and weaken it. A good rule of thumb is you should be able to easily spin the screw and just feel a little bit of extra friction. If it's really stiff, just loosen the nut a bit. Okay, page 13 next, and the last page for bag 3. We're mounting the axle to the chassis. Before we start though, the first bit of the page has us removing the mount for the lower links. It looks like it's to gain better access to the screw heads. Now it would have been easier to fit the mounts now rather than having to remove them first. Much strangeness. Anyway, we don't need many bits on this page. There's two M3 nylock nuts along with the rest of the screws from bag 3. Two M3x12s, two M3x15s and two M3x18s. The first job then is to remove one of the link mounts. Luckily my Bondus Allen keys just about clear the brake discs so I can unwind them fairly easily. When it's free from the axle we can fit one of the 73.5mm links with an M3x12 screw. The link fits to the flat side of the mount and the screw goes straight into the plastic. Nip it up and refit the mount. Repeat on the other side and the axle is ready to mount to the chassis. Fitting the axle is nice and straightforward. The first thing we need to do is refit the centre spline section of the drive shaft. It's still going to drop out if we overextend it while fitting the axle, but we'll just have to keep an eye on it. We'll start with the top link while we've got easy access. They're mounted with M3x18s that pass through the chassis in the hole just in front of the centre skid, through the spacer built into the skid, and through the ball end on the upper link. To keep it on, we use one of the nylock nuts. For now, we'll just do it up finger tight so it's not going to fall off while we fit the other one. Now the assembly is somewhat stable, we can tighten up the nuts. You might be able to get away with a small cross wrench, but a small spanner or parallel jawed pliers makes it really easy. We only need to do them up so they're snug, plus a little bit extra. The lower links now, and the balls fit into the slots in the centre skid, and an M3x15 goes through the hole on the outside. These screws only just need to be bottomed out, there's really no advantage to cranking them down. Fit both of them, and we have the front axle mounted. Very nice. It's fairly stable already, there's a bit of slop that's going to be coming from the ball ends, but it's plenty good enough. It all feels lovely and smooth. We will of course be getting a bit of bump steer, as it's 4-link rather than 3-link with a panhard bar, but I'm sure it's going to do just fine. It's a scale truck and not a race car after all. Okay, page 14, and this is the beginning of the rear axle. In bag 4 we've got a set of bits that look remarkably similar to the bits that we got for the front axle. As mentioned before, since the build is so close to the front, we will just look at the differences rather than go through everything again. Page 14 is near enough exactly the same as page 9, so here's a complete axle diff assembly ready for the next page. On page 15, the only difference is instead of the steering hubs, we fit the locked ones. Even the axle shafts are the same as the front, complete with their CV. It might have been nice to have solid ones, but I'm sure they're going to work just fine. The other minor difference is they don't have us fit the lower link mounts, so rather than having to remove them again later, we just fit them along with the links. I'm thinking the front axle build might have been a mistake or oversight that never got corrected. When the axle's complete, it does look rather snazzy, just like the front. I think the calipers and the brake discs really make the difference. On page 16, they've compressed 2 pages into one. We're building up the links and fitting the axle to the chassis in one go. It's not difficult to follow, but I do prefer it when the steps in the manual are divided up a bit more. Just like with the front axle, we fit the links to the axle first, then mount it to the chassis using exactly the same size screws as the front. It really is almost a direct copy of the front axle, even the slight slop is present. Still, it feels good and solid, but it's not easy to really gauge the suspension until the dampers are fitted, which will take us on to the next page, page 17, the dampers. That, however, is going to be for next time. 5 pages of build is enough for 1 week, even if we did kinda skip through the second half. As always, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if you've got something to say. Bye guys!